this year is The Art of Neighboring. It's based on a book called, surprisingly enough, The Art of Neighboring, right? The book is by Jake Pathick and Dave Runyon. Jake Pathick is a vineyard pastor in Denver at the Mile High Vineyard. He actually started out here in Ohio. He was an intern at the Columbus Vineyard for a while before planting his church in Denver. He also serves on the Vineyard National Board. Dave Runyon was pastor of Foothills Community Church in Denver. And a few years ago, Jay and Dave, along with a bunch of other pastors in Denver, got together and started dreaming about what they could do that would make a huge impact for God in the Denver area. They came to the conclusion that serving the community would be the best way to do that. But then they started to realize that they didn't know their community as well as they should. So they began to invite city leaders to come talk to their group. The police chief came, the mayor came, the city manager came, and others. In one of those meetings, the mayor of Arvada, which is a large suburb of Denver, had come to talk with them. They're sitting in a room with 20 pastors and the mayor. And they asked the mayor, if you could wave a magic wand and change anything about our community, if you could direct us to mobilize all the people that we talk to every week in any one way, what would it be? And the mayor took out a piece of paper and started reading down this list, and he said, I want to live in a community where there's no isolated elderly shut-ins. I want to live in a community where there's no at-risk kids, where there's no single moms living below the poverty line, where there's no crushing financial debt and foreclosures. And he went on and on, and he read down all this list, and the pastors were all taking notes and writing them down, thinking about what they can do. But then the mayor put his piece of paper away, and he said, kind of as an afterthought, if you wanted to have the biggest impact in our city, you would figure out a way to start a neighboring movement. And Jay Pathick and Dave Runyon write in their book that they were kind of shocked to hear the mayor tell them that they need to do what Jesus already told them to do. When Jesus said to love your neighbor. It was like God was using that mayor to say, the smartest thing you can do is just take Jesus at his word and do the very thing that Jesus said matters most. And later on, the mayor and the city manager went on to share with them their frustration as local government leaders. They said, people call us all the time and they say, you need a program for this, you need a program for that. And so we start a program, say, for elderly shut-ins. And for 2 years, it works great. But then the funding dries up and runs out, and things go right back to the way they were before. Same problems, same needs not being met. And so these programs don't make any long-term difference. And then they said that the best way to actually care for people in need in our community is when the people who live around them do it. Because then what happens is people get cared for out of relationship, not out of programs, and relationships always trump programs. Another city leader summarized it all by saying, what you can do with those Christians, why don't you just get them to shovel their neighbor's driveway? So they kept hearing this stuff about neighbors, and these pastors were trying to absorb what the city leaders were saying, and then they started to realize that there was a disconnect between the way that they were equipping the people who God had entrusted them with. And so after this meeting, these pastors started to think and pray about what to do about all this. And one of their conclusions was that Jesus is a genius. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but Jesus was the smartest person who ever lived. He is a genius. And is it possible that when you ask the smartest person who's ever lived how to change the world and reach the whole world with the love of God, is it possible that this genius could boil everything down into one simple command? Is it possible that God has given us a strategic plan already that could literally change the world overnight if only everyone who claims that they're a Christian actually did it? Many of you already know this simple command I'm talking about. Jesus says, love God with everything you have and love your neighbor as yourself. That's known as the Great Commandment because Jesus said it summarizes the whole message of the Bible. And what would happen if every believer in the world decided right now that they were going to take Jesus at his word and take the Great Commandment seriously? Well, a couple months later, these pastors are meeting together again. Another city leader comes and talks to them, and she starts sharing all the reasons why being a great neighbor makes sense. She talks about the fact that people who have close bonds with those who live around them live longer than those who don't. And she says that in neighborhoods where people know the first names of their neighbors, the crime is 60% less. She talks about how when natural disasters occur and the systems are overwhelmed, that the first responders are always your neighbors. And these pastors started to realize, oh my goodness, this neighboring thing makes a lot of sense. And that's on top of the fact that Jesus said it was really important. And then this city leader made another comment that kind of shocked these pastors. She said, from the perspective of us elected officials, we can't really tell any noticeable difference in the way that Christians and non-Christians treat their neighbors. And the pastors wanted to argue with her because they were feeling kind of convicted. But how do you argue with what other people are seeing? And by the way, since writing this book, Dave Runyon has said that he's been in meetings with leaders of over 50 different cities talking about these things, and never once has a police chief or a city manager or a mayor or any elected official ever come up to him and said, oh, you know what, Dave, in my city, actually, Christians are the best neighbors around. My city's way different from Denver. No, that's never happened. And I'll bet if you took an honest look around your neighborhood, your community, whether you live in Hamilton or Fairfield or one of the townships, I'll bet if you're really honest, you know that this same thing is true in your neighborhood. We all know there is not a drastic difference between the way Christians and non-Christians treat their neighbors. Now, I'm not talking about how they treat other people at church. I'm talking about the neighbors who live 30, 40, 50 feet away from you. Okay? So how do we reconcile that with the fact that Jesus says, if you only do one thing, just do this. Just love God with everything you have and love your neighbor as yourself. If you only do one thing, that's what you're supposed to do. And yet, here's the reality of how Christians neighbor in our cities and in our country. We're no different than non-Christians. Now, I know a bunch of you might go, well, wait, Ken. Our church helps a lot of people. And you're right. We do. We give out food at our food pantry. We take food down to Henry Long Tower every month. We send missions team to work at the Indian Reservation and other places. We started Serve City, which has the biggest homeless shelter in the area. Our Christian school is making a huge impact on kids who won't thrive in other schools. We've done a lot to help people. But what are we doing with our own neighbors? And in fact, I have to ask myself the same question that these pastors in Denver were asking. How did I get there? How did I end up being a pastor of a church where we do a lot to help people in other neighborhoods, and yet I haven't been intentional at all when it comes to my own neighborhood with my own neighbors? Well, let's look what Jesus actually says about this. Luke 10, starting in verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? So this guy comes to Jesus. He says, hey, you got a question. But then Jesus does what we see him do a bunch of times in the Bible. He asks the person how they would answer their own question. So Jesus asks, what does the Bible say about this? And the guy answers, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this, and you will live. Now, think for a moment about how powerful a statement that is right there. Do this, and you will live. Jesus is saying that's the path to eternal life right there. But then look what happens next, verse 29. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And so this man comes to Jesus. He asks him, it's really a very simple, straightforward question. And Jesus gives him a simple, straightforward reply. How will you get eternal life? Jesus summarizes the whole Bible, says, here it is, love God and love your neighbor. But then it says God wanted to justify himself because he's thinking, well, there's some neighbors that I do a great job with. Like that Pharisee who lives across the street, he and I see eye to eye. We go to the temple together. We like the same because he's a great neighbor. I love that neighbor. But the guy next door, he is a jerk. He never mows his lawn. He lets his dog poop on my lawn. And he has these loud parties late at night. And I never see him in church. And surely I don't have to love him. God wants me to love the Christians, right? God wants me to love people who are at least trying to live right. And he doesn't expect me to love that atheist 2 doors down who's living with his girlfriend. So he's trying to justify himself because he's loving to some of his neighbors, but certainly not to all of them. So he's looking for a loophole so that he can feel good about picking and choosing which neighbors he has to love. So he asks Jesus, how do you define neighbor? And of course, Jesus told this story 2,000 years ago, right? Luckily, we are so much smarter today, and we have progressed so much since that time. Nobody in this room would actually ever look for a loophole, right? I did. I looked for a loophole, and I found it. I didn't actually consciously look for a loophole, but that's the way my life turned out for many, many years. Because I lived the vast majority of my life pretty much ignoring my neighbors around me. And that's how I got to this place where I could be involved in all of this great ministry stuff at church, starting homeless shelters and healing, doing all kinds of outreach to the community, doing mission trips in Guatemala and Haiti and Pine Ridge, and yet never getting to know the names of the majority of my actual neighbors. Now, in the story of the Bible, Jesus takes this question of who is my neighbor, and he does something pretty amazing. He launches into the story of the Good Samaritan, which most of you know, but if you don't know that story, it's about a Jewish guy who is traveling on a lonely highway, and he gets robbed and nearly killed, and nobody wants to stop and help him. But finally, this Samaritan stops and helps him. And the kicker to the story is that the Jews hated Samaritans because Samaritans were foreigners and they were the wrong religion. Okay? So Jesus takes this definition of neighbor and he blows it up to include everyone when he tells this story of the Good Samaritan. But you see, he's assuming that his Jewish audience is already being pretty great neighbors because the Jewish culture was actually pretty tight. They knew their neighbors a whole lot better than we do today. I mean, they didn't have garage door openers so that you could drive your car right into your garage and never even see your neighbors every day, right? And so Jesus just assumes that in this Jewish culture, they're being pretty good neighbors already, the people they actually live next to. So he takes the definition of neighbor and he expands it. He's like giving them the graduate level of neighboring. And to this group of people, he goes on and he tells this story of the Good Samaritan. And he tells them, when you take care of somebody who's right in front of you, somebody who's in need, and no matter who they were, when you meet some of their needs, if they were right in front of you, he says, well, that is neighboring. And it doesn't matter who they are, it doesn't matter if they're a foreigner, it doesn't matter if they're a terrorist. If they're right in front of you and they have need, you meet their need. But here's how I applied that teaching for most of my life, and probably how most of you apply it. I looked at this story of the Good Samaritan and I thought, wow, you know what? Everybody is my neighbor. Everybody is my neighbor. And then I did this nifty little mental gymnastic thing, and I don't know when I did it or how I did it. I just know I ended up this way. When I thought about this Good Samaritan story and the fact that everybody is my neighbor, I kind of made a little shift, and I said, well, I'm neighboring all the time. That's what the Good Samaritan story really means, is that I'm neighboring all the time. But here's the problem. when everybody is my neighbor, then often nobody is my neighbor. We don't actually be a great neighbor to anybody. And see, what happens is we turn this into kind of a metaphor. You know, Jesus is saying, I need to love everybody. So the story is about how I need to be a more loving person, and that is certainly true, I do. But because this applies to everybody, it doesn't really apply to anybody. And so when I thought about loving my neighbor, I had this kind of metaphoric love for all of my metaphoric neighbors, and metaphorically, things were going fine for me. But I wasn't actually applying this to any actual neighbors or any actual people. But in reality, there were people who were my actual neighbors, who were lonely, who were dying for a relationship, and they're living right across the street from me. Kathy and I moved to a different house a couple years ago. But before we moved, we lived in our last house for over 25 years. And the neighbors next to us had been there for like 20 years. And so, you know, long-time neighbors. Their daughter used to babysit our kids. And I knew his name and her name. And I'd wait when I saw him on the lawn. But that was really about it. You know, we'd never actually done anything with them. Didn't know each other well at all. And I remember one day I had one of my very rare conversations with the man. And he happened to mention, you know, I'd really like to come visit your church, because he knows the pastor. And of course I said, oh, that'd be wonderful. I'd love to have you come visit. But then it turned out that his wife didn't want to come visit. And the reason that she didn't want to come visit is because a year earlier, he had been laid up with a leg injury for about 2 months at home. And I never went over to visit him. In other words, I didn't love my neighbor enough to take 15 minutes to stop by and see how you're doing. You see, I was so wrapped up in meeting all the needs here at church, right, and the Christians that I already knew, that I didn't have time to actually love my neighbor. They moved somewhere else not long after that. We haven't seen them since. But you see, we take the teachings of Jesus about loving our neighbor, and we apply it to everyone, but in the process of aiming for everyone, we don't actually love anyone. And so the point of this book, The Art of Neighboring, is that instead of trying to do the graduate level of, program, of trying to apply this Good Samaritan story to everyone in our lives, that there's actually great value in going back to kindergarten and try to do it with our actual neighbors. Because if the people who God put in authority in our cities can't tell the difference between the way Christians and non-Christians treat their actual neighbors, then maybe we're not really ready for the graduate level of neighboring. Maybe we should go back to kindergarten, draw a circle around the place where we actually live, that God has put us, and then start to work our way out from there. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking right now. You may be thinking, well, Ken, if you go back and look at this Good Samaritan story, it says clearly that everyone around me that I come into contact with is my neighbor. The person that I work with, parent on my kids' soccer team, the guys I play golf with, the server at the restaurant I go to, anybody I have a relationship or anybody I come into contact with, they're all my neighbors. Even when I send a check off to Convoy of Hope so they can help people who are hurricane victims or feed school kids in Haiti, that's being a neighbor too. And if you would say that, then I want you to know that you are 100% right. Those are your neighbor. All of that is neighbor. And that's what Jesus tells us in this story of the Good Samaritan. But here's the deal. All of that stuff doesn't make the person right across the street less of a neighbor. And that's how most of us live our lives. We think that all the other stuff we're doing kind of relieves us of the responsibility to love our actual neighbors. And so somehow the person across the street becomes less of a neighbor. And I think that's the very little secret of how we got to where we are. That's the reason the people who lead our cities can't look around and see any difference between Christians and non-Christians. That's why they can't say, wow, the Christians in our city are really the best neighbors. No, they can't say that because it's not true. We're not any different. And so the goal of this journey for the next 6 weeks is how do we help ourselves or help each other become great neighbors in the way that Jesus defined being a neighbor. How do we do that? You see, your neighbors right now are one of three things. They're either a stranger to you, or an acquaintance, or there's somebody you have a relationship with. Or one of those three, stranger, acquaintance, or somebody you have a relationship with. And so this journey is about how do we help people move down that line from stranger to acquaintance, or from acquaintance to somebody you have a relationship with. Because in order to love your neighbors, Jesus commanded us to do, we've got to have some kind of relationship with them. And the very first step in that process is you've got to know their name. There's a huge difference between, oh, hey, bro, and hey, Bob. Huge difference. You got to know their name. It seems like a very small thing, but it's a very critical first step. And so to help you take that first step, in your very small groups, you're going to get a tool that we call a block map. It looks like a tic-tac-toe board. I put an example of it on the screen here. You also have one in your bulletin. And you can start thinking about this now, even though you're going to be working on this in your small group as well. The way it works is you put your address right in the middle of that map, where you see the little house up there. And then you start to write the names of the people in the 8 closest households to you. Now, if you live in an apartment or condo, it's not going to look like that block back up there. I know that. I live on a cul-de-sac, so my block map is going to be the 8 houses nearest to me on my cul-de-sac. But wherever you live, just think about it. When you walk out your front door, what are the 8 closest households to where God has placed you? And then you start to write down their names. And you can't cheat by asking your spouse, oh, what's his name? Or, and don't cheat by taking somebody you happen to know who's like 16 houses away and jamming them in there so that you'll feel better about yourself. Now, just the 8 closest households, you write down their names. Now, just for fun, let's do a little experiment. If you would be able to come up here and tell everybody else in this room all the adult names in the 8 closest households to where you live, if you could do that right now, I want you to raise your hand. And this is church, so don't start lying. Okay? If you could name, okay, we have about 2 people in the whole place. That is pretty much average. They've done this in thousands of churches. Virtually nobody knows all 8 of the households that are close to them. Most people don't even know half. Jay Pathak, the Vineyard pastor in Denver, says this. I'm not a poet. I don't write lyrics. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not an expert on love. But I do know this, that in order to love someone, it's helpful to know their name. Makes sense, doesn't it? So when you get your block map in your small group, or you can use the one from your bulletin outline, maybe you want to stick that on your refrigerator and work to start filling in those names. That's where I put it on my refrigerator, so I see it on a regular basis, and then I notice, I still got a couple blanks there I got to fill in. And here's the deal. If you're like me, a lot of my neighbors I met before, and they told me their name at some point, but I just didn't think they were important enough to retain their name, even though I lived near some of them for a long time. And that means if you want to do this, if you want to follow the command of Jesus and love your neighbor, it might mean that you have to walk across the street and humble yourself a little and say, I know you told me your name before, but I forgot it. What is it again? Or maybe you see your neighbor at the mailbox and you walk over and you say, I can't believe you told me 3 times, but I forgot what your name is. Or maybe, I can't believe that we've lived near each other for a couple of years and we just waved, but we never actually met. And then you go write down their name on your block map on your refrigerator. so that you won't forget. And that is the first step to obeying this command of Jesus, to love your neighbor. And it's the launching pad for a whole new way of living in your neighborhood. Because here's how it works. It goes from just a wave when you see him taking out the trash, to a, hey man, how you doing? To a, hey Mike, how you doing? And once you know their name, then it's a lot easier to take the next step. Like, hey Mike, I've got this really heavy thing in the back of my car. I need to move out. Would you be able to give me a hand for a second? Or, hey Mike, I noticed, is that your son that moved back in with you? How's that going? And of course, it takes time. But it starts with the first step. It starts with that moment where you think about this block map on your refrigerator, and you start to think how many blanks are still out there, and you got to find their names out, and you start to think about what Jesus said to do when it comes to loving our neighbors, and then we start to reconcile those things and actually do what Jesus said. And of course, the block map tool doesn't stop with just finding out their names. That's the first step. The second step is learning about them. And the third is learning to really know them. In other words, what are they passionate about? What kind of career plans do they have? What are their dreams? What are their spiritual beliefs? But can you imagine what would happen if everybody in this church would simply say, I'm going to learn and retain the names of the people that God has placed right around me? Let's look at one more scripture this morning. The Apostle Paul's in Athens here. He's talking to these Greek men and women. He stands right below the Acropolis in Mars Hill. And he says this in Acts 17, verse 26. From one man, God, made all the people of the world. Now they live all over the earth. He decided exactly when they should live, and he decided exactly where they should live. God did this so that people would seek him. Then perhaps they would reach out for him and find him, even though he is not far from any of us. So what is he saying? He's saying that you have been placed in your neighborhood for a purpose. God put you there at a specific time and in a specific neighborhood, and he placed specific people around you in that neighborhood for a reason. And the reason is so that when those people around you begin to reach out for God, they have a handle to grab onto. They have somebody there to help them find God. You don't live in your neighborhood for the reason you think you do. You don't live there because of the school district. You don't live there because of how many bedrooms are in your house, and it's not because of the good curb appeal or anything else that you think. It's because God put you right there for a reason. And if you will let this sink in, it will change the way you relate to your neighbors. It will change the way you see all these different people who are living around you. And it doesn't mean that you're going to be best friends with all of your neighbors. Some of your neighbors are busy and they don't put a priority on relationships. They don't have any desire for a relationship. And that's okay. But guess what? Some of your neighbors would give anything to have a real friend. And it might be the ones you least expect. What would it look like if everyone in this church said, I'm going to learn and retain the names of the 8 households right around me? Can you imagine the impact? It wouldn't be just 100 people. It would be thousands of people who are impacted by this. If each of you were to simply say, I'm going to make a point to learn and retain the names of the adults in the 8 closest homes to me. I'd like the worship band to come up. We're going to do a closing song. As they come up, the truth is, what you do in your front yard counts just as much and is just as big a ministry as what you do in the children's ministry here on Sunday morning, or what you do when you're volunteering at our food pantry. It counts just as much as when you show up here on Sunday and sing in the worship band, or when you usher, or you're part of the elderly. What happens in your front yard when you neighbor, starting with learning names, is a ministry that will count for all of eternity. Let's stand for prayer. thank you for your great commandment that you said summarizes everything else in the Bible. You want us to love you with everything we have and love our neighbors. Would you help us to take your commands seriously? Would you give us a concern and a compassion for the people that live around us? And help us to take your command literally and love our neighbors that actually live around us. Would you help us to make time and to get to know and to build relationships with the people that you have placed around us so that we can love them as you've commanded us to do.